thank you. First of all, thank you all so much for coming, and I owe a special word of thanks to my colleagues at University of Oxford and especially at Bodleian Libraries to bring some of this material to my attention and to encourage me to prepare this presentation. So it's funny, so these are some manuscripts of history of science, and I have to give you a bit of background. This is only my second time in England, and the first time I was here was 15 years ago, when I was a visiting scholar at the Warburg Institute. And my colleague, Dr. Charles Burnett, and I were talking about some manuscripts of history of science. And somehow word came out to the question of provenance and how the provenance of manuscripts has a bearing on our understanding of the history of science as we consider it. And it sort of lingered in my mind many years, and I did other stuff until I came here last term for some unrelated project. So basically, when we talk about history of science, what do we mean? Especially history of science in, say, Islamic societies. Sometimes you say Islamic history of science. It's when you call it Islamic, it's not so much that its material is Islamic, but it's science produced or studied by cultures defined by hegemony of Islamic societies. So what do we mean by that? How do we even come to understand that? So over time in the West, as it were, like we have come up manuscripts, instances of these works of science, although my particular interest is math and astronomy, and some of them have made it to the West somehow. And we sort of study those texts, we edit them critically, I don't know, call it them, etc., translate them, this question of translations. So I thought, well, I'm here, so why not look at some of the manuscripts of history of science? So I'm going to first talk about these manuscripts in one order, and then we'll see what I mean by that. This first manuscript, so you may notice that some of these manuscripts are just pure text, and some of them have diagrams in it. And diagrams obviously make sense because, of course, if you're doing mathematics, you need to draw the circle, draw the line, etc. But the first one, which is, you see, is a really beautifully calligraphed manuscript, in such a nice hand, and it's also beautifully preserved. It's all text, and it is, if you look at the catalog listing for this manuscript, it says it's a universal history of the world. So, is that a manuscript of history of science? So first things first, it's a lot of these manuscripts, including this one, are collections. These are not single author manuscripts. These are collections of a number of manuscripts put together. In this case, of course, the reference in the catalog, or at least in one of the catalogs that I looked at, I later found a separate catalog which has the correct listing, lists it as the Universal History of Al-Tabari. Al-Tabari was a 19th century exegete, and he wrote a universal history. And of course, you flip through it and you see this is not one, but this is actually 5 different manuscripts put together. But also the manuscript of Al-Tabari you see in the beginning, it's not the original Arabic in which it was composed, it's actually a Persian translation, it's a medieval Persian translation. Which also brings to question that, so again, when you talk about these pre-modern Islamic societies, where learning is defined by learning in the Arabic language, just like learning in the West was defined for the longest time by learning in Latin. You have, of course, this situation of sometimes, especially Persian as the second dominant language of that culture, that you would have translations to that, or you would have texts that would be identified, or they would be labeled in the different language, and you would sort of go between those. Typically, if it's the original Arabic, it is meant for the scholars who know enough Arabic to read it, and if it is Persian, it's meant for some patron who wants to have a nice book, but he doesn't know enough Arabic to read it. So, all right, this is enough about the first one, and I'll go on to the other ones, and then we'll come back. This one again is a text of universal history, which again is a universal history, a text of history of science. So we'll have more to say about that later. This one, so this text is originally, the original Arabic is from the 9th and 10th century. The Persian translation is about a century after that. This one is a much later universal history. It's a 15th, 16th century universal history. This is the period of great shifts in West Asia. This is, of course, when the dominance of the Ottomans and the Safavids changes the cultural landscape. And this is, I think this is a text, it's again a Persian text, which was patronized by the Safavids, which is to say the Persians. Again, the catalog, unfortunately, in the online Bodleian catalogs is, for instance, this is a work which is by its author, it's divided into 3 volumes, and each volume has different parts. It doesn't specify which part it is, and sometimes it's difficult, so you need to really flip through it and find out. Okay. Also, I want you also to notice as we go on later that these are different hands. These are very different hands, not just in handwriting, but these are different styles of calligraphy. These are, like, you can say they're not really different scripts, but these are different styles of calligraphy. In fact, all 5 of them are 5 different styles. So we'll get to that. More of history of science. So this one definitely looks like a manuscript of history of science because you see the mathematical diagrams. And so I think all of these codices, except for the second one, are collections. In that each of them hosts a number of manuscripts in it. And these collections especially make sense in the case of manuscripts of so-called hard science, like if you're studying, say, I don't know, math and astronomy, etc., because some of these are shorter treatises, and you would just bind them together. But also, something else about these is that if somebody, I'm sure many of the members of the audience are familiar with works of classical Greek mathematics. So many of these are actually, at least they're identified as translations of Greek works into Arabic. So Arabic as the language of that culture and language of education in that culture. And you would go through it, and it is that, except once you sit down to actually read the text, you see that it's not really a translation. These are not really translations, even though obviously they have been identified as translations. And this is not a matter of cataloging, but just in the tradition. Rather, these are like commentaries. So, I mean, when you, like, so why is that important? The importance is that you can think of a work in, say, History of Mechanics as a commentary on Isaac Newton's Principia. But that doesn't mean it's the same work. It's like it's a continuation of that tradition. You could be doing science like 100 years after that, and this is completely different science, but it's like commentary on that first original. The second one you see is again the different hand, the different style. It's a little bit older. You see it's a bit faded. And this would be, for instance, if it is not as nice, it's probably some scholar's personal copy, but if it is nicer, it is something that is prepared for a patron. Finally, the last one is also a collection of manuscripts of history of science, but you notice that there are, it's again very beautifully prepared, which means it's for a rich patron. But also, there's not a lot of diagrams because a rich patron would not be. And again, you see, again, unfortunately, this is a collection. This particular work is in Persian, even though it mixes Persian and Arabic, which is again a sign of this. Now, so all of this is of course interesting, but my interest was piqued in this particular 5 because I mean, not only are there 5 different hands, 5 different styles of calligraphy, but it also arrived at Oxford in 5 very different periods, and these are 5 very different acquisitions. So again, I've made a note. I don't know how much of it we can go through. I believe so. Some of these arrived through purchases from prominent merchants who were active in the East. We have made labels. Thank you very much. You see that these are from different collections, and some of you may recognize the names on these collections because. So I mean, of course, you have Marsh and you have Laud. These are very prominent scholars of the previous centuries. But some of the other collections are actually merchants. These are merchants who were, I think one of them was a civil servant in colonial India. And one of them was a merchant who was in fact even not directly dealing between the Orient and England, but the manuscripts arrived via intermediary of Dutch traders. Okay. And that is important because so again, we can talk about this particular. So I think this is from the 19th century, and then it goes like 18th century until it was in the 16th century. So this is in the reverse chronological order. But also, this has the point I'm trying to make with this is that the instances that we have of these manuscripts, and all of these are really beautifully prepared, beautifully particular acquisitions, the result of those particular collections. So you would think that what kind of material would be purchased, say, by a Dutch merchant in the Persian Gulf, or by, I don't know, by an archbishop, right? And those material would in fact be at some level representative, but not fully representative of the tradition. For instance, this would be a material which would be interesting for an outside observer, that it can be sold at a decent price, but also something that would be kind of representative, but also special. So, for instance, this is really the last point I want to make, is that, I mean, the manuscripts of Al-Tabari, I mean, every major collection of Oriental manuscripts in West Asia has tens of these, of different things. I mean, if you want to edit this text today critically, none of the copies, at least in this collection, are those of the extreme, like, oldest, most pertinent examples. But those are ones that were kind of nice enough, but also representative enough to be purchased. And why is that important? The importance is that when we look at this to construct the history of science in those societies, or history of, I don't know, education in those societies, whatever, one must remember that there is also a filter that they have gone through. So with that, I'm going to close and invite you to look at these. The collection, the catalog numbers have been kindly printed by my colleagues, and these are in reverse chronological orders. I had something prepared about each of these particular collectors, but unfortunately we don't have the time. So, enjoy. Thank you.